Thank you for coming, everybody. This is a great group here in this great facility of Acton Villageworks. My name is Lori Cooney, and I'm a member of the League of Women Voters. One of our mottos, if you see our pin, it says, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." I love that motto, and I think sometimes, I think when you get out of your house and you come to something like this, it's like you're getting in the game. We have a great speaker for you tonight in Jennifer Peter with the Boston Globe. She helps guide one of the country's top newspapers through, at minimum, a dynamic time in journalism. If I want to be dramatic, I think she probably feels like she's in a cyclone every single day. However you describe it, she's living it in real time, 24/7. They do not want to be acknowledged, but I do have a few special guests tonight. So, newly elected Selectman John Benson is here. Thank you for coming so much. Congratulations. Pam Lynn is here, trustee of the library, also newly elected. Janet Adachi is here. Thank you, Janet, for your help getting this on some calendars. And our town moderator just walked in, Peter Ashton, so thank you. Tonight is a League of Women Voters sponsored event, but we like to say you don't have to be a woman or a voter to join. The League is nonpartisan, but that doesn't mean we aren't political. We define nonpartisan that we do not support or oppose candidates or parties, but we do advocate for positions that have been studied and gain support of our members. The state's mission statement, the Massachusetts League of Women Voters mission statement, is that the League encourages active participation in government, works to increase understanding of major public policy issues, and influences public policy through education and advocacy. This speaker series is an example of the education and advocacy. The role of the press in our democracy was a subject we voted on at opening meeting last fall. Many of us thought it was a top issue. And from that vote and that meeting came this speaker series that begins here tonight and then will continue in May at the Boxborough Library. The goals of the series are to educate ourselves about the relationship of a free press and a strong democracy, to understand what actions we can take to preserve a free press, and to learn how to discern fact from propaganda. Freedom of the press is among the first post-constitutional civil rights. It's right there in the First Amendment that says Congress shall make no law that prohibits freedom of the press. Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart explained freedom of the press well when he wrote in 1974 that the primary purpose of the First Amendment was to create a fourth institution outside the government as an additional check of the three official branches. That's why sometimes you hear people say that the press is the fourth estate. When it's done right, the free press civil right allows reporters to speak truth to power. It also serves a very important role of keeping the electorate informed. And that's getting more difficult for many reasons. Television stations used to rake in the money, but now many media companies are actually working in the red. The world of journalism has had dramatic, colossal, huge changes over the past 2 decades. While the number of sources for news has expanded tenfold on cable channels and digital platforms, the number of people who make a living bringing you that news has shrunk by about that same tenfold number. You know, reporters and anchors and columnists can feel like they're part of the family. You may not be able to start your day until you open the Globe and see what Dan Shaughnessy has to say about the latest sports something. Or you may not be able to go to bed at night until you turn on Anderson Cooper and see what his panel has to say about the latest headline from Washington. To show the power of journalism, I put together a 2-minute video with some highlights from movies and TV. I can tell from the Googles, I don't need to set this up, but I will. It starts with this film, which was released 44 years ago. The scene shows this man is a main anchor, and he's expressing what many of us feel some nights while watching the news here in 2018.
So, I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window, open it, and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore!"
There's nothing that's more important in a democracy than a well-informed electorate.
I just want to make sure you know you're still on the side of the door.
When there's no information or much worse, wrong information, it can lead to calamitous decisions and clobber any attempts at vigorous debate. That's why I produce the news.
We're all grateful to you.
You're spinning out of control.
No, I'm not.
You're terrified you're going to lose your audience, and you'd do anything to get them back. You're one pitch meeting away from doing the news in 3D.
This isn't nonprofit theater. It's advertiser-supported television. You know that, right?
I'd rather do a good show for 100 people than a bad one for 1 million, if that's what you're saying.
What is it you're talking to me about right now?
I've come here to produce a news broadcast that more closely resembles the one we did before you got popular by not bothering anyone.
We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men, not from men who feared to write, to associate, to speak, and to defend the causes that were for the moment unpopular.
All of you have done some very good reporting here. Reporting that I believe is going to have an immediate and considerable impact on our readers. For me, this kind of story is why we do this.
The Founding Fathers gave the free press the protection it must have to fulfill its essential role in our democracy. The press was to serve the governed, not the governors.
So now back to reality. And a woman who is living it every day at the Boston Globe. Jennifer Peter has just been promoted to managing editor, which means her name is on this masthead of every paper. There are 6 names on this, and her name is one of them. Two of the other names are John and Linda Henry. For the past several years, she's been the Globe's Metro editor, overseeing all aspects of local news as well as digital platforms. She began her career 26 years ago as a reporter, and her focus was on politics. She lives in South Boston with her husband and 2 children. I don't know their. Please help me welcome Jennifer Peter.
Thank you so much. Working okay? Sorry. And thank you for having me here in this beautiful space and giving me such an interesting assignment. I've been a journalist for a long time and spend most of my time worrying about the stories we do and the people who are doing them and the people who are affected by them and the people who are reading them. And I don't often get time to think about journalism in a more academic way or to really delve into what I've been doing for the last couple of weeks, thinking about what I would say tonight. So thank you for that. And I got the list of questions you had put together, and I use them to inspire me and guide me, but I tend to focus on the parts I know, but feel free to press me on the ones that I haven't addressed. I guess there's a Q&A portion at the end. Lastly, as I was telling Lori when we spoke a couple days ago, I'm a registered independent. I'm trained as a journalist not to express opinions about politicians. I don't give donations. I don't put out yard signs, and that would really, it's a no-no in journalism. No one who is in the newsroom really can do that or should do that. But it's difficult to have the conversation we're about to have without a particular politician's name coming up, and not always in a particularly positive way. And I want to say up front, this is not based on my politics or my opinion about his politics, which I won't divulge, but about what impact he's had on the concept of truth and facts. And that's the bread and butter of what I do. I care about that a lot, and I do have an opinion about that. So your first question was, what role does the press play to provide checks and balances in a thriving democracy? And this is an easy one. You saw these inspiring videos, which give me chills every time. But obviously it plays an absolutely critical role, and where local news outlets have died, corruption has thrived. Ultimately, it's voters who hold governments accountable through the ballot box, but if governments are acting in secret, as it often is, if there's not a press corps watching them, then it's hard for voters to make the wisest decisions. And I won't repeat some of what Lori said, but you know, none of the statistics about newspapers or news outlets are good. Fewer people are reading them, fewer people are producing them, fewer of them exist. I was going to quote from some Brookings Institution report that shows that there are many fewer outlets. And that means that while newspapers remain in big cities, and there are 2 in Boston, quite different, but there are still 2, our circulation is down, revenue is down, the number of reporters we assign to beats is down, but the suburbs have been much harder hit, and there's a lot of localities that don't have people watching what the governments are doing at all. And there are literally, I'm sure, thousands of examples out there. I just wanted to spend time on one that you guys, and as I was listening to everyone talk, I worried that I'll be telling you all things you already know, but probably the best, the sort of the iconic example occurred, or was brought to light in 2010 in Bell, California. This is not something I have any personal connection to, but it's a suburb outside of LA that most of us had never heard of until the LA Times started writing stories about it. But it's a city that once, it's about 37,000, and it once had a newspaper called the Industrial Post, which had been in existence since the 20s, and it had active civic organizations, but then sort of industry died off there, people moved away, service groups withered, voter participation became abysmal, and the newspaper closed its doors. And then in the early 90s, they hired a city manager who was hired in at a reasonable salary of $78,000, which was a little less than the previous guy had made. But with literally no one watching, he gained an immense amount of power and money over the next 17 years. And by 2002, he was earning $250,000, and then $300,000 in 2004. And then in 2005, they had this vote on the day after Thanksgiving that changed what kind of city it was. It changed it from a general law city to a charter city. And what they did say in the question was that this would allow the city council members to make as much money as they wanted. These state limits that were put on how much councilors could make were eliminated, which doesn't sound all that sexy or interesting, but the measure, it was the day after Thanksgiving, not a day for high voter participation. 400 people participated out of the 37,000 people. Like 300 of them were absentee votes. It was bizarre. And they passed this law, and then over the next 5 years, this guy, they approved, they made more and more money, and these same city councilors approved these unbelievable contracts for this guy until the LA Times began reporting on it in July 2010. And this is from the Times. It said, Bell, one of the poorest cities in Los Angeles County, pays its top officials some of the highest salaries in the nation, including nearly $800,000 annually for its city manager. It was unbelievable. It's just like this, it's just like a textbook case. And in addition to that salary, Bell pays the police chief, Randy, you don't need to know his name, $457,000 a year, which is about 50% more than the LA police chief. And more than double New York City's police commissioner. And this is a town of 37,000. 3 months later, the city manager was taken away in handcuffs as the citizens of Bell cheered because this money had been taken from them for so long. The LA Times was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. A couple of years later, the city manager was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But in a story that summed up how this guy was allowed to run amok there, the LA Times wrote in December 2010, the normal checks and balances from a robust local press to engaged civic groups had largely vanished before or during his reign as city administrator. And then a local good government person wrote, in short, the Bell spectacle is what happens to communities without their old-fashioned diligent news coverage by veteran newspaper reporters, or at least smart reporters led by veteran newspaper editors. And that was just, for all of us in journalism, that was the case of, oh my gosh, this could be happening anywhere that we're not looking. And we did actually find a similar case the Globe did a year later, when based on a tip, we looked into one of our investigative reporters looked into the salary of the head of the Chelsea Housing Authority. And we found out that he was one of the highest paid public housing authority officials in the country, earning $360,000 to oversee 1,400 apartments. And he made a salary nearly twice the salary of the housing chief in New York City. And not only that, but he was telling the state he made $160,000 so there wouldn't be any scrutiny of his crazy contract. But he told the pension board that he was his full salary because he did want to make a full pension. And our reporters did a lot of great reporting on it, and he was sentenced to 3 years of prison in 2013, which was double what prosecutors had asked for. And at the time, the Judge Woodlock, said, through self-interest, you have committed very serious crimes. You have lined your pockets while picking the pockets of the people of the Chelsea Housing Authority. It's money taken away from programs that are always under stress. So that was sort of our textbook example. Again, Chelsea was a town that hadn't gotten a ton of scrutiny, and we looked in there, and there were things going on, and there was no check and balance there. And I'd also say, I would add that I don't think it's only a decline in newspapers that can contribute to a rise in corruption, and maybe that's stating it too strongly, but I think there are checks and balances. It's not just newspapers, but I think sometimes the one-party rule that we have seen in Massachusetts, where Democrats have controlled so much, there are things, I think there can be, when there's two parties, at each other at the State House, I think it can provide a healthier debate potentially. And the Globe has time and again uncovered backroom deals that have occurred among party leaders who are not organically held in check by an opposing party. And I hear, as Metro editor, I heard all the time so many complaints about the Globe being liberal and unfair to Republicans. But that always makes me laugh, because if we had focused only on Republicans in this state, we wouldn't have all that much to do. And Sal Macy might still have a job, and Brian Joyce and probation officers might still have jobs based on who they know rather than their qualifications. And most recently, the Globe did some very difficult stories about the state Senate president, whose husband had allegedly been harassing other men at the State House. It was a terribly sad story, but in the end, incredibly important, and a testament to the importance of a brave and responsible news organization, in that case a reporter who was quite dogged about going after that. It's sensitive. And I guess to this point, I mean, to this point, I think there is a lot of confusion between the newsroom, which is an unbiased source of news. We try our best. I think we do a pretty good job. But that is certainly our goal and our mission, and the editorial page, which is, they're supposed to have an opinion, and we all get painted as liberal, but we are guided by this. Really, it's sort of our holy grail is to be unbiased and to, bend over backwards to be as fair as we can to both sides. Your next question was, what grade would you give the press today on the execution of these responsibilities, and why? And it seems like a simple question, but the answer is anything but, because there's such wide variability among the press these days. I'm proud of the work the Globe has done, covering Boston and the state, and if you haven't already, look at the Spotlight team's recent 7-part series on racism in Boston. It's one of Boston's biggest problems, racism that is, and one that people often don't like to talk about, or they think it's actually not a problem at all, but the series made it clear how much work remains to be done in excising structural racism that makes it more difficult for people of color to flourish in our city. And the series took on the establishment in just about every way: city government, developers, colleges, corporations, and the decisions and biases that had helped perpetuate the city's image as a place not hospitable to African Americans. And I personally had very little to do with that project, but my husband, who's a member of the team, did. And still 4 months later, he and other members of the team are being asked to speak at events across the city, events like this, as part of what seems to be a real reckoning with the problem. And he just did about, I feel like, 3 in the last week. So that shows, I think that's an example of the role that the press is still playing in holding institutions accountable. And I would give an A+ to the Washington Post and the New York Times for the relentlessly good work they've done covering President Trump. before he was elected and during his tenure in the White House. And they do this day in and day out with a president who's constantly denigrating them and what they do and their reasons for doing it. And that's, it's not, I observe this probably just like the rest of you. I'm not covering the White House. I mean, we do have people at our organization who are, but I think they're doing, you know, immensely difficult and good work. And I've really loved watching them compete. I mean, as a journalist, it's great to see that, you know, one side, you know, beating the other to a scoop. But I also like their joint sense of purpose, that, you know, even when they're upset that the other organization got a big story, they're both very defensive together. I think they're saying that we, you know, we're an important bulwark against efforts to undermine the media in the country. And next week the Pulitzers will be awarded in New York, and each year, whether the Globe finds itself in the winner's circle or not, the announcement and the stories behind them are an inspiring testament to the power of the press. And invariably, as I scroll through the list of winners, I see the work of journalists who bravely and tirelessly took on those in power. Or this year, undoubtedly, I assume there will be a story in there about involving the articles taking on a titan of Hollywood who'd been having his way with aspiring actresses for years. But last year, the shoo-in for the Pulitzer was the work done by David Fahrenthold of the Washington Post, who doggedly reported on Donald Trump's false claims of philanthropy, and he was also the reporter who landed the scoop about that thing Trump said on the Access Hollywood tape. And the prizes are capricious, and there are a lot of amazing stories that don't go honored each year, but that was last year's shoo-in. And here's an excerpt from the Post story written after the prize was announced. This is from the story. Fahrenthold's prize-winning reporting was a follow-the-money tale that combined dogged reporting. He called 450 charitable organizations to ask them whether Trump had ever donated money. With the creative use of social media, especially Twitter, to crowdsource the public's collective knowledge of people and events. In the process, Post editor Martin Barron, once ours, said Fahrenthold 39 reimagined investigative reporting. Traditionally, Barron said reporters have kept their work secret and guarded until they have developed enough information to publish. Fahrenthold instead shared his progress on stories via Twitter and openly asked readers for tips and information that guided his work. And they go on and on. But he did this incredibly inspiring work, showing that Trump had never given money to his foundation, and he'd used a lot of that money for paintings, etc. And it was really incredible to see how he did it and how collaborative and collegial he was about it. He'd help people in different markets, you know, publish their own stories about it. And his profile became so high that he became the recipient of that tip that led to the revelation of the video. And they say in the story that this instantly shook up the presidential race, which is true, but for a day. So in many ways, with a revitalized Washington Post and a still strong Times and strong dailies like the Globe, I think we're in somewhat of a golden age of accountability. But at least in Trump's Washington, this journalism, as with this work, is not having the same impact it had in the past. And that things that would have doomed, other candidates, so much of what we saw in 2016 didn't, and for a lot of reasons. I think the first reason that's really important to keep in mind is that Trump tapped into an undercurrent in the US that the mainstream media in most cases failed to detect. And it was that connection with a sector of the electorate that allowed Trump to survive scandals that would have torpedoed others. And I thought David Brooks, it was really interesting. I think this was right after Trump won the primaries. He wrote a Mayor Culpa. He's a columnist, a moderate Republican columnist for the Times, I'm sure you know, saying that he and others had not adequately understood the anger out there. And he said, well, some respect is in order, referring to Trump's success in the primaries. He said, Trump voters are a coalition of the dispossessed. They have suffered, lost jobs, lost wages, lost dreams. The American system is not working for them, so naturally they are looking for something else. Moreover, many in the media, this is David Brooks speaking, especially me, Probably me too. Did not understand how they would express their alienation. We expected Trump to fizzle because we were not socially intermingled with his supporters and did not listen carefully enough. For me, it's a lesson that I have to change the way I do my job if I'm going to report accurately in this country and on this country. And I thought that was really powerful because I think he hit it right on the the nail on the head. I think that we did miss a story, and we missed and that alienation that Brooks refers to really, I do think, helped people look past the tape and look past the scandals and say, here's a guy who understands us more than other people do. And then reason number two that these aren't having the same impact, I think, is because many mainstream ethical journalists were almost hamstrung by their commitment to fairness during the election. There was a sense that if you were tough on one candidate, you had to be commensurately tough on the other candidate without asking the question, what if there are more things to criticize about one candidate than the other? It's something that's been called false equivalency or false equivalence. And I'm not in any way saying that Hillary Clinton was a perfect candidate, far from it, but there was a sense of equating her weaknesses with his, even if they were in many cases apples and oranges. And as I said, to start, reporters are trained not to express their opinion. They must be unbiased. They may have personal opinions about people or about who is qualified to hold office, but they're not supposed to express it. And reporters are particularly sensitive, also as mentioned, to the longstanding criticism that they're too liberal or in bed with Democrats. But what happens if a candidate says something untruthful? Can you just call them a liar or say outright that something is a lie? Or does that somehow make you sound opinionated? And reporters who were once unwilling to take Trump or his surrogates on, either because they thought he was irrelevant, which proved not to be the case, or because it seemed to bring them precariously close to expressing their opinion, have become less reluctant. And there was another mea culpa recently from Jeffrey Toobin, who's a New Yorker writer and a CNN contributor. And he says, I think there was a lot of false equivalence in the 2016 campaign, that every time we said something, pointed out something about Donald Trump, whether it was his business interests or the tape, words I won't say here. We feel like, oh, we gotta say something bad about Hillary, and I think it led to a sense of false equivalence that was misleading, and I regret my role in doing that. And I know I have similar conflicts, as have others in the Globe newsroom, but I do believe in facts, I believe in the truth, and I think that either something's true, we were debating this a little bit, I think something's true or it's not, and it's not a matter of opinion. Third reason I think these stories that once would have been bombshells have had less of an impact is because I think facts have lost their power. And I think the president is definitely one of the reasons, because he routinely denies things that seem to be empirically true or professes things to be true that are patently false. And I don't know if any of you have gone to politifact.com, but it's a nonpartisan fact-checking organization that won the Pulitzer Prize the year it launched. And it takes any questionable statement made by a president or public official and basically, and I've actually tried to do this as a journalist, like, during gubernatorial campaigns, during, the Warren-Brown Senate race, there's these things coming up that one side is saying is true and the other side is saying is not, and you try to take you take one little piece of information and and it can be hard to get to the truth, but in the end, if you do dogged enough reporting, you can get there, and PolitiFact is extremely good and extremely fair, and they've rated both Obama and Trump on, basically every contested statement they've made, and said whether it's true, mostly true, half true, mostly false, false, or pants on fire. I tried to look back to George W. Bush, but it doesn't look like they were I don't think they were very active during his presidency, but I think they were just starting then. But Trump is mostly false, or pants on fire. His statements are 69% of the time, whereas Obama, he did have a couple pants on fire claims, but he was 26% mostly false or pants on fire. So I think, and then also the Post published a story about Trump's statements in January 2000 of this year, and it was when he had broken through it to say he'd made 2,000 claims that were not true. And it says, with just 10 days before he finishes his first year as president, Trump has made 2,001 false or misleading claims in 355 days, according to our database that analyzes, categorizes, and tracks every suspect statement uttered by the president. That's an average of more than 5.6 claims a day. But again, these are things that would doom a politician, or at least enlighten the populace, but the lies haven't mattered for a couple of reasons. For one, Donald Trump has disconnected the word truth from its meaning. When he says something is fake news, which he does a lot, it generally means that it's news he disagrees with, or news that he wishes had not been released. And Margaret Sullivan, who's another great columnist to read, she's a columnist for the Washington Post, she used to be the ombudsman for the Times, she said in January of last year, she wrote, fake news has a real meaning, deliberately constructed lies in the form of news articles meant to mislead the public. For example, the one falsely claiming that Pope Francis had endorsed Donald Trump, or the one alleging without basis that Hillary Clinton would be indicted just before the election. But she said, though the term hasn't been around long, its meaning already is lost. Faster than you could say Pizzagate, which is another sort of fake thing that happened out there, the label has been co-opted to mean any number of completely different things: liberal, claptrap, or opinion from left to center, or simply anything in the realm of news that the observer doesn't like to hear. So Trump has blurred the line between truth and fiction in an effective way that can undermine the impact, again, of these stories that again, from the Post and Times and other outlets, which are, I think, based in fact. But there are also other forces at work, which brings me to reason number 4. And social media has put many people, those who are only friends with or only follow others with the same political preference, into an echo chamber in which they hear what they want to hear. If they are a Trump supporter and following other Trump supporters, for instance, they will not be part of a lively online discussion that objectively evaluates whether the president is messed up. Instead, they will hear from a lot of other people who dismiss the latest story as biased or unimportant. It will become easier to dismiss a story, and the story will consequently have less impact. I use him as an example, but this is absolutely true across the political spectrum. The marketplace of ideas has, for many people, become much narrower, not a marketplace at all, really, because of how we share information through social media. And of course, reason number 5, there are a few more nefarious things going on here, like the Russian trolls who set up free fake accounts on Facebook and other social media sites in 2016 and masqueraded as regular users who supported Trump or hated Clinton. And these accounts racked up hundreds of thousands of online followers, particularly on the social media, on Facebook and Instagram. Many of those have been shut down, and Facebook is obviously in the midst of a reckoning in DC, but the damage has been done. And there's also another force at work one that I don't fully understand, but it's increasingly being brought up as something that news organizations need to understand and need to have actually become a beat we cover. I don't know at the Globe if we have enough resources now to dedicate someone to bots, but they play bots, which are internet robots, they've played a role in amplifying the voices in this already polarized environment that already exists on social media. And they're really a force to be reckoned with, it sounds like, from what I have read recently, and a force to be frightened of. For those of you who, like me, are new to this world of bots, I would recommend an article from this, I can give you the link to this in the Columbia Journalism Review, which gives advice to journalists about how not to be tricked by bots. But it's instructive to all of us, I think. First of all, as I mentioned, a bot is an internet robot, and it's used to describe any software that automates a task. And here's what CJR had to say, the Columbia Journalism Review. Bots are everywhere. A report by the Times recently outed about 3.5 million of them on Twitter. They're on Facebook and Reddit and weaving their way into government processes. You might even follow some, or they're following you. They're not all bad. Some of them contribute worthwhile information, critique, or new modes of storytelling. For instance, the Fort Collins, Coloradoan produced a chat bot for the 2016 elections as a way to provide information about local candidates and races in a more conversational way. But they can easily be set to bully, intimidate, harass, pollute, and push political agendas online. And the CJR says, if humanity is going to retake social media and push back against the tide of automated attention manipulation, journalists need to get smarter themselves so as not to fall prey to these electric demons. And they suggest start covering bots, and they're changing strategies as a beat. And apparently, you know, and bots can often be used, they will generate a lot of likes on a particular Facebook post or on a tweet, and it'll make it seem like there's much more of a groundswell behind them. And the CJR says, and I think that's what I think can really distort truth on the internet. If you see, you know, actual fake news coming from a Russian troll, and then there's, you know, 1 million people liking it, it begins to take on a reality that doesn't really exist. As they manipulate credibility by influencing social signals like the number of aggregated likes or shares a post or user receives. And this article says, people see a large number of retweets on a post and read it as a genuine signal of authentic traction in the marketplace of ideas. Do not fall for this. And their argument is that trends are basically over. They're too easy to manipulate, that we can't make our news judgments based on what's trending online. And this goes for any information online that feeds off public signals, including things like search autocomplete in Google or content recommendation lists. Journalists, and I don't think anyone can any longer rely on information sources reflecting some form of online popularity. And that's been really illuminating to me, because I didn't realize that was happening until, you know, recent months when it's been so much in the media. And that's pretty much exhausted my knowledge of bots, but it was this interesting, really interesting thing to delve into. And my final point, number 6, is on why the excellent journalism that is being executed these days is not having the same impact it might have, is that not all media are created equal. And while some news organizations are doing their job admirably, others are not. Take the case of Sinclair Broadcasting, a conservative-leaning company that forced its local anchors, people widely trusted by viewers, to read a statement questioning the fairness of mainstream media. And Lori is going to play for me a compilation of the statements put together by Deadspin, which went viral. All right, so Deadspin, it's a, I think it's a sports site, but they splice together these anchors from 300, I think if, oh yeah, it's right there. Oh, it isn't?
But it's my fault, I'm sure it's
I guess they must have a lot of skill at compiling videos from their work on sports. If you could just potentially search for it, or I could reenact it.
Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about the trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country.
Plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first. Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 And while I tend to be wildly optimistic about the power of the First Amendment to ultimately allow for the truth to prevail by protecting the right to unfettered debate, I found this episode really terrifying because while I'm an ardent reader of newspapers, I know not everyone is, and if voters and citizens are reliant upon a Sinclair station for news, and they are the largest broadcaster in the country, reaching more than 38% of the nation, then they might really believe that the huge important stories being broken in DC and elsewhere are actually fake, based on statements like this coming from trusted people who are supposed to be unbiased journalists. In the wake of the video, which went viral, the nation's top journalism schools wrote a letter of protest to Sinclair, and this is an account from the Baltimore Sun. The letter said that while news organizations have historically had and used the prerogative to publish and broadcast editorials clearly identified as opinion, we believe that line was crossed at Sinclair stations when anchors were required to read scripts making claims about the troubling trend of irresponsible, one-sided news stories plaguing our country. The letter acknowledges, and I think this is important, that no news organization is beyond critique, and the Sinclair video was correct in pointing out that social media, and those bots, have been used all too often to spread false news. But the letter added these are two very different things. The work of professional journalists who produce real news and the false accounts on social media. In making the leap to disparage news media generally, without specifics, Sinclair has diminished trust in the news media overall. And I think this is also important. It's ironically, Sinclair's use of news personnel to deliver commentary, not identified as such, may further erode what has traditionally been one of the strongest allegiances in the news landscape, which is the trust that viewers put in their local television stations. And making this all the more alarming is the fact that Sinclair is planning to purchase 42 more stations, allowing the company to reach more than 72% of American households. And whose FCC will be deciding whether to approve this acquisition by this conservative-leaning station. It is Donald Trump's FCC. And this means that Trump's frequent disregard for facts and for mainstream media in general could be amplified in ways that are difficult to combat, and that the power of true stories could be diluted. Dean Baquet, who's executive editor of the New York Times, addressed this in a segment on CNN on Sunday about the state of the press. It was a segment on the state of the press under Trump. And he said, if he creates a culture where Fox and Friends and Jesse Waters are regarded as serious journalism, and the Washington Post and the Times are not, he will have done long-standing harmful effect on the country. It's out of control, and his advisors should tell him to stop, McKay said. And he said it's actually affecting the civil life and debate of the country. But to bring us back to where he started, McKay noted at the end of that segment that a worse threat to journalism today is sort of where we started. It's the decline in local newspapers such as the Denver Post, whose hedge fund owner is slashing the newsroom. And over the weekend, journalists there rebelled, writing editorials in the opinion section that blasted the hedge fund, which is called Alden Global Capital, and begged for its life. And McKay said, this is a major city, Denver. This is a newsroom that now is on the verge of having fewer than 100 journalists. That's unbelievable. That means that things won't be covered. School boards aren't being covered. This is a crisis in American journalism. And still more, he said it was a bigger crisis than Trump's attacks on the Post and the Times. He said, we're big, we can stand it, we can even thrive, and it can even inspire us. So this is me again. So here's hoping that the current assault on the truth can ultimately serve to inspire us, and that the media can, again, play the role it has in our society, holding government accountable in a meaningful, impactful way. And this gets back a bit to your next question, and this is sort of where I'll end it, but what are suggestions for cultivating informed and critical consumers of news? And my first bit of advice, and I can't believe I'm saying this in a day when we have so many pieces of very real, crazy news every single day, but if something sounds really nutty, check your source. During this 2016 campaign, I had a couple people in my Facebook feed who would post these stories that would, if true, had marked a major change in the presidential race. And who knows, I might have been reading the fake news perpetuated by these Russian trolls, but and there was some that I wanted to believe, that this would be a good news story, this could change things. But when I Googled to see if the Times or the Post or the AP or any respectable news organization was reporting them or trying to, nothing came up. And if there's a big story out there that's true, there will be hints of it elsewhere on the internet. And every one of those times I would look, like, oh my gosh, I can't remember the really crazy, momentous things, and I couldn't find it anywhere else out there. And yes, the Post and the Times get scoops, Globe gets scoops, that other news organizations have a hard time matching immediately, but A, they are respected news sources, and if true, others will ultimately match it. So if something's out there on its own and it just stays out there on its own, there's a good likelihood, you should take that as a hint. And as I mentioned, PolitiFact is a really good source, and it has a search function. You can put in, a statement that you heard, or if you just want to know, I know there's a lot going out there on immigration, what's true, what's not. It's a really good place to go. And during Zuckerberg's testimony yesterday, they put something out on Twitter saying basically, bring it at us. If you hear him say something, do a tweet with this hashtag, and we will check out right now if what the senator or what Zuckerberg was saying were true. So they're very good. And I do think, despite what some people say these days, the truth is knowable, as I said, but can require a little work, and it will require putting trust in some institutions that have proven time and again to have integrity. One of your other questions was, this little sidelight here, but what strategies can one use to seek out opposing points of view in order to get to the facts? And I guess I reject the premise of that. When it comes to facts, there are not opposing points of view. There are facts that are incontrovertible. The opposing points of view come into play when deciding how significant or objectionable those facts are and what actions one should or should not take in response. Another piece of advice I would say is, and this gets a little into the internal workings of the paper, but because there are news organizations out there doing irresponsible things, don't let that tarnish your view of the profession as a whole or of the tools responsible journalists have long used to keep readers informed. For instance, the president and many others, especially those who have been the focus of a story built upon anonymous sources, believe the presence of anonymous sources in a story inherently undercuts the story's credibility, makes it fake news. And yes, they should be used sparingly and with rigorous safeguards in place, but they are an absolutely essential tool for journalists to tell some stories. For instance, many of the Me Too stories with victims who for legitimate reasons do not want the world to know they were assaulted, or stories about government officials who come forward who might lose their job if it was revealed they were whistleblowing on their boss or revealing information that leaders would rather the public would not see. An example of this for us recently was as I mentioned, the really difficult and important work that our columnist Yvonne Abraham did, bringing to light allegations of sexual harassment against the Senate president's husband. And that story was fraught for a lot of reasons, with men who were both embarrassed and frightened to admit what had happened to them. And we pressed Yvonne to convince at least one of them to let us use their name, because that is always optimal. But we proceeded with the story regardless after a very rigorous process. And this includes, in general, making sure you have more than one source. In this case, we had 4, and that they had direct knowledge and hadn't just heard of the issue at hand through others. In this case, they had, sadly, direct knowledge. And that we had a clear sense of their motivations. Was this a longtime enemy of the target of the story? Someone who might like to ruin somebody, who might have an ulterior motive? And in this case, through Yvonne's many conversations with them, we were confident they did not. Anonymous sources don't make a story fake. You just have to make sure that there's a rigorous process behind that, ensuring that your news organization is not being used by people who want to lay into an enemy without putting their name to it. And piece of advice number 3, and this will sound self-serving, but the type of journalism that will keep the public enlightened costs money. And to be sure, money isn't the answer to everything. There are some very wealthy companies out there, like Sinclair, that for a variety of reasons might not be doing their part to inform the electorate in a responsible way. But we can't produce the type of journalism we do, the daily hits that shed a light on the workings of government, and the in-depth investigations that take months to complete without money. So if you can, please support journalism with your pocketbook, not just or only the Globe, but I will gladly take your money, but your local paper or the Times or the Post or the nonprofits out there that are doing consequential national investigations. So that's my last piece of advice. Go subscribe. Thank you.
Are there questions? Do we have questions out there? Can you raise your hand, and then I'm going to come back with a mic? Okay.
Over my lifetime, which is long enough, the news has gotten much more speculation, and this was evident in Sunday's Globe, which the lead article was speculation about who's going to run 2020. So there's a lot more of that going on. and at the expense of what I think is local news about what actually happens. If you can talk about that.
That's interesting. I mean, did you? And I know we don't want to do this microphone thing back and forth, but was the story the one of the 2020 election? Did you find it not informative or not informative enough to push off something that was based on fact? I mean, based on something like a person announcing they were running for president, or?
I think it's way too soon and way too speculative to talk about now when so much is going on in the world.
I think that's a fair point. I guess I reject the idea that speculation can't be informative. I mean, informed speculation. And one thing that comes to mind, and I'm sorry I keep on bringing up his name, but we have a reporter who knows New Hampshire politics better than anyone, James Pindle, and he wanted to do a story in December of 2015 basically saying, and it was based on his knowledge of the New Hampshire electoral process and on his knowledge of the, he's covered New Hampshire politics forever and knows the rhythms, and he knew, and he said, I think, there's a really good chance Trump will win in New Hampshire, which we're all like, what? No, like, that's not going to happen. And we ended up not doing that story because there was some concern about it and not trusting in his ability. I mean, I do think there's a role for papers to not just report what happened, but if you have knowledgeable journalists, responsible journalists, to be able to give readers a sense of what's coming down the road. I don't know if I'd put this Sunday article in that case. I mean, I think it was sort of almost a, I mean, just like there's always people from Massachusetts aspiring to be president, and look, like and these words, I don't know, will Deval Patrick run, will John Kerry run, but there's little rumblings out there that's it's not necessarily a news piece more than Massachusetts is at it again. So I think it's almost like entertainment rather than informative. But I take your point. So turn that off. Okay.
Yeah, I was concerned about your statements about not calling a lie, and this false equivalence thing. Maybe I'm just naive, but it strikes me that if somebody, whose name rhymes with rump, is spewing one falsehood after another, I think the media needs to do the service of the headline saying Trump lies about this, and then itemize his statement and point out why, well, this part has some truth to it, but it's ruined by the second part of his phrase, which implies this, when in reality, this is the fact. And just, if everybody in the real news called him out, point by point, with big headlines calling him a liar, there's nothing wrong with that.
I couldn't agree more, and I think that was something, as I was saying, I think people during the campaign felt like, can you just call something a lie? And I think they do now. I mean,
not in the headline of this.
Oh, I mean, and I can't say, I mean, the Globe, we have a slightly, or the stories that go on A1 are generally, we haven't done our own database of Trump's lies, but we did do a story, we did pick up the Washington Post story on the fact that he told 2001 lies in less than a year. I think that's been a thing that, I don't know, I think at the beginning he was saying kind of these things that didn't seem to be true, but he was almost like this fringe candidate. But then of course he became the nominee, and I think a lot of people regret not calling him out back then, and I think that's a full-time job for a lot of people in DC right now. And I think it isn't, I mean, it's not even just, I don't want to express opinions, but I mean, it's not just that he doesn't tell some things, he says some things that aren't true, he also goes, like one day he is pro-DACA, one day he's against DACA. So it's hard to sort of, and we do write quite a bit about that, how he, whatever he says on Twitter that morning could be completely different than what he said the day before. I do think there was a reluctance. I do think a lot of people and newspapers are calling him out now. And I totally agree with you. I think it was a mistake, and I think it was a lesson learned, hopefully.
In the era of infotainment, which used to be called the news, I think we're falling into the trap of following the shiny object, and the man whose name will rhyme with rump, I like that, recognizes that he can distract the media by throwing out some outrageous comment, and the media chases it and goes after it because of ratings issues, of whatever infotainment, you know, that they get their funds from. So.
I mean, are you referring mainly to CNN? I mean, yeah. I mean, we have this new newsroom in Boston that has a ridiculous number of TVs, and often they're on CNN. And it is sort of nonstop what Trump said most recently, and I think there is, you know, and you see a lot of this on social media where, you know, there's always a sense that is, you know, he will do something. He'll threaten war, a missile strike against Syria to cover up the fact that, and I think it is a tricky balance. I don't think you can ignore the fact that he just threatened war because the rest of the world is focusing on Stormy Daniels or what Mueller's doing. But I think you have to have you have to have analysis, and you have to have smart stories that say this is what he's trying to do, and trying to show that this is and he's not alone, but he's a master of it. That there are people who try to manipulate the media that way, and it's really tricky when it's the president of the United States on a public social media outlet. But it's definitely something to keep in mind.
I watch this, and I think, although I don't watch Fox News on a regular basis, I sometimes turn it on, and I think we're looking at the president as the identified patient. But we really have to address Fox News. Somehow, if that is truly the source of everything that comes out of his mouth, we need to get to that source, because he believes, apparently, everything they say. So maybe we need some education about Fox News, even on a daily basis, to the rest of us who don't watch. In other words, if we're talking about identifying things that are being said that are not true, maybe we need to start calling them out, because some of the things they say are firing him up, and he's the one that we're going after when we really need to focus more on them.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what one can do about Fox News.
Boycott the people that advertise.
Yeah, and that, I mean, you saw the kids from Lakeland, Parkland, sorry, do that very effectively, and that's absolutely possible. I don't know, but I do, and yeah, I mean, I think there's some instances where every other news media outlet is focused on sort of some recent thing that makes Trump not look great, and you'll see Fox focused on Hillary's emails, you know, or like the late, you know, things that and so there's, you know, I guess this is one of those times when you hope that an unfettered First Amendment and people being able to see that what they're saying sometimes is either potentially not true or completely beside the point, would make people turn away from it. But I do think this echo chamber we have on social media is in definitely strengthening Fox. I mean, I'm sure it's not a funny cartoon, but kind of funny, where, you know, obviously the president hasn't been very good at following his talking points, like about congratulating Putin, et cetera. And someone was saying, if you could put those talking points on Fox, we'd be all set, because there you go. So, I mean, it is. I mean, I think. I hope that, you know, and again, this is probably naive, but I hope that in the course of time it'll be shown that these people are often not telling the truth and are speaking opinion almost all the time on there.
I might need a little bit of your expertise on this question. So my understanding of Article 19 is that journalists are supposed to report equally during a campaign. Each party should get equal representation. Article 19 for international human rights and access to information? No?
Go ahead. You have the power. Yeah. If you turn yours on.
No, I have the power. I am not familiar with that. What I do know, on TV, you need to give equal time. There's rules for. Yeah. I remember the whole thing with Arnold Schwarzenegger movie being on, and then they had to give equal time to his opponent in California. There are FCC rules, and I mean, as a rule, we do want to. You want to do equally. You want to take both candidates and say you scrub them. You make sure. They don't, I mean, this is like, sort of local stuff. You don't make sure they don't have liens on their house, or there's not court cases we don't know about, or bankruptcies, or something that indicate they maybe aren't great money managers, or you do it on both sides, and you tell what you say, both sides fairly. But I do think, it doesn't mean that if I do one negative story on Donald Trump, I immediately have to do something. I mean, I think I don't know of any article that's forced us to do this, but that's like, you want to be a credible source of information about an election. You need to analyze both sides equally. But some people give you more fodder than others.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Sorry.
Just talk loud. No, go ahead. Is this on? So the point that I was going to make, sorry, now I'm shouting because the mic was working, is that not at this point in time, but during the campaign, many of the news outlets were sort of, I mean, it was this vicious circle, right? They're trying to do this balance, giving equal representation to all of the candidates. But when you have one candidate who's like way up here and like every 5 minutes trying to attract attention, it makes journalists' life. It was an incredibly difficult balance, right?
We'll just. You okay if I just go right on the riffs? Okay. Did you have a question?
Yes, but I don't want to use this. Can I just talk really loudly?
Yes, go and stand up, Deborah, hurry up.
All right, so,
Thank you,
here's what I'm wondering. Would the Globe and would any other newspapers consider having a sort of regular desk devoted to kind of a meta look at what's happening in media? And I say this because I heard something on NPR the other day that really made me go, oh my God. So now not only can video be created out of nothing and inserted, right? But now audio can also be created out of nothing. If you get 20 minutes of somebody's voice, you have all the phonemes you need to create new text. You type in the text, the person's voice says it. So that is, I mean, that's not a print issue, but here we go. And so I'm wondering what you think about that idea.
I think it is, I think it would be great. And if Brian McCrory, my boss, were here, he would say, I have been trying for years to revive a media beat, and that is a goal of ours. I mean, it's one of those things that we used to have a media being, and I think some reporters aren't all that interested because you don't want to say, oh, the local anchor just left to go to a different, and I think that's what media has been. But media now, and I am, my little bot lecture there, I mean, there is so much happening out there in how we consume news that has nothing to do with, local TV news or even the media. But I think it would be really smart and really important. And our challenge, and I think it's something we would actively do. We've had a hard time finding the right person within our newsroom who to do it, but it's something I think we certainly, if we get a chance to hire ever, we would be looking for that. So I think it is extremely important.
What?
You hear that?
I'm listening.
Just a couple more.
Yep.
Should we try that?
Yeah, no, it will.
Okay. You mentioned in your remarks about the mobilization of the dispossessed. And I'll see how close I can get. But you talked about the mobilization of the dispossessed. And the thing that really strikes me is that we can mobilize the media, we can do all sorts of things, but if we're not preaching to the people that are dispossessed, we're not going to make a difference. And what I find very striking is even in the current environment, where I think the news media have been more accurately reporting a lot of the reality that's happening in Washington. You've seen the president's popularity still hover at 40%. He's mobilized that group, he has the support of that group, and he's able to continue that support. How can we find ways to influence that through the current means that we have?
That's probably a better question for a political scientist than for a journalist, and I feel like I'm not speaking from a deep well of knowledge here, but I do, what it sounds like, it sounds like there could be quite a different story in the midterm elections this year, and I think there are going to be people out there who will, the opposite of never Trump people, the people who will always stand by him. I think some of them, it sounds like, are becoming, they weren't happy with when he agreed to a budget agreement that didn't do enough to build the wall. I think some of, there have been plans that have gone through that have actually hurt specifically the people who rallied around him. But I think it's not going to be so much about changing the minds of the people who helped elevate him into office, but mobilizing more people who oppose him. And I think, because I think there were a lot of people who sat out the 2016 election, is my impression. There's been news stories about it, and I think the black vote went way down, and you now wonder a little bit if that was, some part of that was about some of these Russian trolls out there sort of creating division and making, but there were a lot of people who were very mobilized by Obama who just didn't go to vote, and it may be less about those supporters becoming fewer in number and more about people out there. A lot of women have been very young, and young people have been very motivated by what they have seen coming from Washington, and that may be where you see the ability to potentially change how things are going in DC. But I don't know that I don't know if there's a way to change the minds of people who believe he speaks to them in a way that other people don't.
Where's Gwen Eiffel when we need her? I think if we had some town forums where we could have people on all sides of the issues to share their points of view, that probably would be a very effective way to at least hear one another, even if we don't agree, and walk away and still not agree. And I would love someone like Gwen Eiffel to show up and do more of what she did so beautifully.
There is an organization that says that.
Yes.
Do you want to go, John? The battery died, so now we're manual.
Shout it out.
The Globe ran a story, it was the Wednesday before the election, page 1, below the fold, a reporter who said, Trump can win this thing. Brexit states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin could well go Trump's way and tip the election. Who was that fellow, and what's happened to him?
I remember the story, but now I don't know who. Well, why don't we find out? Just a Google away. I don't know. I'll find out.
Good story.
Yeah, no, it wasn't. I mean, I guess going back to your question, that's speculation much closer to the moment, but I do think even in responsible mainstream media can have a certain way they think things are going to go, and I think it's really important to get out of the lane sometimes and really think like, well, do we actually know that somehow that Trump will become president? Like, we didn't, and there were a lot of signposts that indicated that something could be afoot, and indeed.
Let's thank Jennifer.